My name is Jeremy Jackson, and I'm a historical researcher. Bear with me just for another moment. I'm noticing that my video is overlapping with my notes, so I was just trying to figure out how to do that. Well, I've been researching for the last few years a series of murders and overlapping murders that occurred during the 19th century in central Minnesota, and all of them had connections to Crow Wing Village. Because of that research, I became interested in this study, and some of my research overlapped that of Doug Burke's. Most of you probably know where Crow Wing State Park is, but just for the sake of showing those that may not be as familiar, Crow Wing State Park is in central Minnesota, a few miles southwest of Brainerd, and I grew up. Can you see my pointer okay by chance?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I grew up here. Crow Wing State Park is here. It's at the junction of the Crow Wing and Mississippi rivers. This is an image of Clement Beaulieu Sr. and the 1850 federal census. It shows him living at Crow Wing in 1850 as a farmer. And that's going to be important as we go through the presentation that we know he's there by that time. Until this Brainerd Daily Dispatch article was published in September of '56, no one believed that a photograph of Crow Wing Village existed. But according to the article, they recreated the photograph, and I wanted to see those, but I did research and try to find them, but I couldn't locate the photos. I did study 1950 aerial of the area, and it has the same issue as it does today. The foliage and trees had grown up so much from this vantage point that I assumed was a vantage point that would be impossible to recreate the photograph. So as I initiated this study, I found the original photograph in Minnesota Historical Society. It's actually labeled as Sauk Rapids, and Benjamin Upton had taken the photo, but it was in an album put together by another gentleman named Bromley, and I think he had mislabeled the photographs. So really the whole point of this study was to prove this isn't Sauk Rapids and it really is Crow Wing Village. So I did purchase a very high resolution image of the Upton photograph, and very quickly realized, as I pointed out earlier, that the foliage had grown up so much that you can't take this photograph 20 feet up the riverbank of the village site without going down by the water's edge. And I also studied LIDAR of Sauk Rapids and quickly determined there's no chance at Sauk Rapids. The riverbank on the western shore abruptly rises about 50 feet, and the river bend also does not match that which is represented in the Upton photo. So in order to recreate the photograph, I determined that a drone flight would probably be best so I can get on the other side of the trees and get on the same elevation and location line as Upton. I created this linear projection model to determine where the photographer had been in 1863, and it aligns with LIDAR indications of sellers on LIDAR and then projects onto a cropped image from the Upton photo. And here it is overlaid on a topo or satellite image. And then I estimated where the drone needed to be to recreate the photograph and approximately where the photographer was. I talked to Barry Osborne at the time. He was the Crow Wing State Park manager, and he enthusiastically wanted to see the study completed. And so he reached out to the Minnesota DNR and obtained a flight permit for the drone, since drone flights are not allowed in state parks without a permit. In December of 2019, with Barry Osborne present, Dan Higstead of Easy Street Productions of Brainerd completed the flights, and it was about a 15-minute flight. He produced about 35 still images and about 15 minutes of video imagery as well. But when the flight was completed, the colored images are actually from that. The flight had been too far to the western bank of the river, so we couldn't quite align. So you can't see it too well, but there's a trail here from the upper parking lot that aligns with the road that appears in the Upton photograph, and those are one and the same. So the drone needed to be further to the eastern bank. So I created this image from Dan's image to show him where approximately the drone needed to be, and a second drone flight was scheduled and occurred the first week of January 2020. And again, Barry Osborne from Crow Wing State Park was present during the flight. This flight produced one video in no stills, and from a frame 4 minutes and 41 seconds into that, I found an image that perfectly overlaps with the Upton photograph. So this is the image from that day, about 20 feet above the river. This is the same image from Upton, and this is the overlapping image. Again, the hill or the road from the upper parking lot overlaps perfectly with the wagon trail. If you had a large copy of this photograph on your computer, you could see the wagon rut tracks coming down here, and it perfectly aligns with that trail today in Crow Wing State Park. This is a mirror image of the Upton photo with Hegsted's photo underneath. This is a stacked image. It's cropped just with the core village. Another stacked image, not quite as cropped. You can see on the left is Crow Wing Island and the bend in the Mississippi River as it goes to the north. The angle of this photo is nearly north. It's maybe a couple degrees to the west. And then I have overlapping images. Again, this is at 100% opacity of the the Hegsted photo over the Upton photo, and then at 40%. I do have a video they produce. It slowly fades back and forth. I can put it on repeat, but I could not make it work in the presentation, so my apologies. But I'm glad to share that or send it to anybody that's interested in seeing that video. So obviously the topography study it proved there was a really good match between, it obviously confirmed it was Crow Wing or represented old Crow Wing, but one of the peripheral findings was that the profile dimensions of the modern day restored Bolio house at Crow Wing State Park and the hip roof Greek revival structure occupying the exact location within the Upton photograph of Crow Wing Village, there was discrepancy in the shape and size of the building. And so while I was doing the study, I also was doing a literature review, trying to find as much documentation as possible as well to try to determine why was there a discrepancy. And again, you can see the discrepancy. They're both Greek revival architectural buildings, but one had a hip roof and one was slightly wider than the other. So I'm going to share just a handful of documentation that I found, and then I'm going to share a hypothesis at the end that might solve this mystery or untangle this mystery. The first was this WPA interview with William Besson. His family had moved to Crow Wing and Belle Plaine in 1875 or mid 1870s. And his quote about the building, or when he's asked about the buildings at Old Crow Wing, he says, Clem Bolio's house burned shortly after we came here, and then Levi Bailey's father built the one that still stands there. The house that stands outside the south, or just south of the railroad at Camp Ripley, close to the highway, came from Crow Wing, which is interesting because that's the house location that was determined to be the Bolio house during the studies in the 1980s. This article, published in Sauk Rapids in 1857, mentions that C.H. Bolio, the proprietor of Crow Wing, is building a house. It's designed as a residence. It's already enclosed and will be, when completed, a large, spacious, and elegant building. Again, Bolio family moved there in 1849. This is 1857. Another article, this was written by Clem Bolio Jr. when he was an adult and actually a reverend up at White Earth. He wrote that his dad, with a large force of loggers, sawyers, and carpenters, erected a cluster of post buildings, one of which was a large 2-storied log building, clapboarded outside and sealed within, designed for his residence. It's interesting he mentioned this one was a log building, because the one that's restored at Crow Wing State Park is actually a timber frame building. And this article mentions that Tom Bosley is moving into the Bolio house at Old Crow Wing in 1915. So another mention of a different Crow Wing or a Bolio house. And that is, in this interview with Levi Bailey, he talks about all the families that Gus Bolio and Clem Bolio hired to live at the village site in that Bolio house to cultivate the land and to maintain it for the Bolio family. One of those individuals, which I'll just mention briefly, was a Johnny Chisholm, and he moved there according to this interview and in some newspaper articles I found too in 1910. That's actually my father-in-law's paternal grandfather. My father-in-law is Jack Chisholm IV of Brainerd. So here's a topography map or satellite image of Crow Wing State Park today. This is the restored Bolio House. This is a 1939 aerial. I highlighted where the Bolio House today is located, and the farmhouse was still standing in 1939. That farmhouse also stands in the 1899 Mississippi River Commission maps. And when you overlap 3 images, the satellite view showing the Bolio House today, the 39 aerial photography, as well as a 99 Mississippi River Commission's map with this road, and this road, by the way, was the north boundary of the Fort Ripley Military Reserve, that farmhouse overlaps perfectly. So it was a few yards southeast of the Bolio House. And this map was drawn by William McAvoy, and he laid out the Leech Lake Military Road in 1855 to 56. It started in his survey notes at the Bolio House, which is documented in this image. The interesting thing about this, and this image isn't truly laid out north and south, the angle of the Upton photos here is pointing at the corner of the structure, which really means it's probably this structure up on the hill. And so I have the following hypothesis of what occurred. There were 3 Bolio houses built at Crow Wing. They're documented in newspaper articles. The first house was constructed in 1849, was a log structure according to Clem Bolio Jr. House 2 was built in 1857. That was a frame structure. House 2 was removed, likely, to the farms in Morrison County, one of which was restored and returned in the 1980s to Crow Wing State Park. House 1 then burned after the village abandoned. That again was the log structure. So House 3 was built to maintain control of the land, and 4 families were eventually hired and documented to have been hired by the Bolio family to live in this house. House 3 burned sometime after August 1939, and that was also documented in the Brainerd Daily Dispatch. And then House 2 was returned to Crow Wing State Park, which actually was, in my hypothesis, the 1857 house. So this is a LiDAR image showing where the late 1870s house was, the 1857 Bolio house, and there's an outline potentially of the 1849 Bolio house. I'm just going to leave this up on the screen for a few moments. I know that this is being recorded. This is pretty lengthy, and I'm going to be out of time if I read it all. But it shows where the 3 of the structures were located. The big house on the hill would be here, the restored house here, which was the 1857 structure, and then the 1870s farmhouse. Ironically, about a year after I completed the study, the digitized files of the Douglas A. Burke papers at St. Cloud State University came online, and I hadn't seen this until I found it. And this was a PowerPoint that Doug Burke had put together titled Old Crow Wing. And I believe it's image number 24. He had attempted himself to recreate the Upton photo. And so this overlay, this mashup of images is actually Doug's work and his slide. The road, again, from the upper parking lot is back here. So it really needed to be upriver just a little ways more, but he was down below the location of the photographer. Again, he needed the drone to get on the other side of these trees. And then 2, I wanted to share this quote by Doug. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so I'm going to be out of time. But the point is, the question of validity of any historical hypothesis becomes a matter of personal choice, with each person having their own different levels of acceptance. What one perceives as the best explanation of the accepted facts does not necessarily imply an absolute understanding of those facts, but rather a relative understanding based upon intellect, theoretical orientation, and perhaps the persuasiveness of previous scholars. I do believe that there's new empirical evidence that suggests that the standing Bolio house in Crow Wing State Park today is not quite, it's not the 1849 house, but yet the second Bolio house constructed there. I would invite anyone who has any comments or questions about this study to reach out to me. My contact information is in the lower left, and I appreciate the Council for Minnesota Archaeology for giving me this time.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.